In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about how you can have an awesome interview. Things that you can do before the interview, of course during the interview, and then even after the interview in order to successfully sell yourself to an employer. So the very first thing you want to do as you begin your preparations is you want to assess yourself. Figure out what your strengths are, what personality traits or experiences or skills do you have that that particular employer would be interested in. Of course, you also want to think about your weaknesses, not so much because you want to share those, but because you want to be able to have strengths that you can use to overcome those. So if an employer were to see a weakness that you might have, you can share an experience or a strength that you have that would compensate for that weakness. You also want to know as much as you can about the potential employer. So find out about them as a company, as an institution, what their values and their goals and their history are, what types of products they make, if they actually make products. Learn as much as you can about them. While you're doing that, I would also encourage you to think a little bit about what some of the challenges that they might be facing are. So why are they hiring a person? Why are they looking at you? What do you have that you could bring to that potential employer to help with that pain point that they're facing? Now, you won't know that exactly. You won't know what their challenges are exactly, but you can kind of deduce that based on what you read online. So look through their website, look at some videos online, perhaps even just Google the company. Find out more about the company so that that will help you when you go into the interview. You also want to write out some potential interview questions. Just like a major final for a class, you wouldn't go into that blind without having studied and prepared a little bit in advance. Similarly, you don't want to go into a job interview without having thought about what potential questions might they ask me. And write out some answers so that you can prepare and rehearse those answers so that when you do get asked those questions or something similar to that question, you're ready to go. Of course, you don't want to sound like you're reading the answer, but you want to be as prepared as you can. So practice with some friends or come into Career Services and do a mock interview. Think about, again, those questions that might get asked and your potential answers so that you're ready to go. I would also encourage you, in addition to researching the employer, research the recruiter, the person who's actually going to be doing the interviews with you. Look on LinkedIn. Find out, was there something that he or she did in the past or in the current role that he or she is in that might resonate with you and you might be able to connect with that employer better. Don't stalk the employer, of course, but when you share information, if you know that a particular area is passion of theirs, that will help you to talk more about that particular area. I would also encourage you to prepare your proper attire and tools that you're going to take in with you to the interview. So in most cases, that means wearing an interview suit. If an employer says, please dress in casual, that means business casual, not jeans and a t-shirt. So in that case, you would want to wear a nice pair of slacks or a skirt with perhaps a nice top. You don't have to wear the full suit if they don't say, wear business professional. If you don't know, it's always better to err on the conservative side instead of going too casual. In addition, bring in an extra copy of your resume. Have a nice folder that you can keep that in, and maybe on the other side where you can take notes should that arise. You might also, if you're a graduate student, bring in some slides on paper about your research talk. Don't bring the full talk or the full presentation, but bring those that are more exciting, the slides that have pictures or charts or graphs. So that way when you're talking about your research, you can set those in front of the recruiter and he or she can review those as you're talking about your research. So bring in paper slides rather than relying on an iPad or a computer device, because that's going to be harder to read, harder to follow for the recruiter than that paper slide would be. You also want to be sure that you're preparing with the STAR or SAR for short method. So what that means is if you get asked a behavioral question, tell me about a time when, you can have a specific story that you can share with that recruiter using the STAR method. Even if you don't get asked an actual behavioral question, perhaps they just say, tell me about your strengths. Again, if you can share a specific story, it makes that strength sound much more credible. So what is the STAR method or the SAR method? It stands for situation first. So give them a specific situation. If they ask about your leadership skills, don't just say, oh, I tend to be a leader in the lab all the time. A specific time that you were a leader in the lab, a project that you worked on. Nail it down so that it's very detailed and give that situation. If you use the STAR method, then the next step would be your task. So what was the solution that you were trying to come up with? What was your specific role in that? Otherwise, move on to the A for the action step. What was the action that you took? This is where you really should spend most of your time when you're giving the answer. So here's the situation, but this is all the stuff that I did. These are the steps that I took. And then finally, conclude with the results. Many of our students will forget the R, forget the results piece when they're telling a story. So always include that outcome. So what happened? What was the outcome? A couple of examples where a behavioral interview question might start would be something like, tell me about, give me an example of, tell me a time when. Those are specific stories. You know you really need to jump into this SAR or STAR method. So when you're in the interview itself, what are some things that you want to keep in mind? Number one, as I mentioned, you want to be well groomed. Hair, nails, makeup, everything should be kind of basic. Nothing that's going to be too showy depending on what type of environment you're going into. I would also encourage women, if you're going to be doing a lab tour, make sure that you've got probably pants instead of a skirt on, so that way there aren't any issues within the lab with safety. Have the right tools with you. I mentioned having the resume and a pad of paper to be able to take notes and so forth. Have a nice pen so that if you do have to take notes, you're not writing with something that's maybe got a logo from another company on it. Always include those specific things when you're putting together your interview toolkit. Be on time, not too early. I used to have a student who would come an hour or an hour and a half early before an interview just to get himself kind of in the position, but it actually freaked the interviewer out. So the interviewer was wondering, why is the student here so early? Is he listening to the answers or the questions that I'm asking? So make sure that 10 to 15 minutes is kind of that sweet spot. Don't come late, obviously, so allot time for parking or anything that could go wrong in order to be able to be there 10 to 15 minutes before your interview starts. Practice your handshake as well. That handshake is going to be one of the very first impressions that you make on an employer, so it needs to be strong. Make sure the webs of your thumbs are meeting when you reach out to extend your hand. Don't do one of those limp fish handshakes or a knuckle breaker. If you've never had anybody give you feedback on your handshake, I'd encourage you to go do that before you have an interview. Make sure that your handshake is a positive and a strong one. Also, have good posture. It doesn't mean you have to sit straight upright, but have good posture. Lean in a little bit if you're excited about something or you're really demonstrating that you're paying attention to what they're saying. Make good eye contact. Not that you're not ever blinking and staring at them during the whole entire interview, but probably make more eye contact than what really feels comfortable. That way they can see you, you come across as more credible and more believable. Keep all distractions aside. So that might include your phone, but it could also include something like a water bottle or a pen that you're constantly clicking. Anything that's going to distract you from the interview or the interviewer from you, you want to have completely out of the room. One other thing I would say about distractions is sometimes that can even include things like smells. So if you wear perfume or lotion, I would minimize it or not wear it at all that day in case your interviewer is allergic or sensitive to that particular lotion that you have on. Likewise, bad odors like body odor or cigarettes probably aren't going to create a positive impression either. So minimize and get rid of all distractions. Many students feel like, okay, I've done the interview, it went great, I'm done. When in reality, there's still some follow-up that you want to make sure you're doing. The number one thing is, while you're still in the interview, ask what happens next. What is the timeline? What can I expect when? That way you'll know when you need to follow up after the interview. I would also encourage you to evaluate how you did. Was there an answer that you really just hit out of the park? You did such a great job with that answer. If so, you want to make sure that you write that down so that you're ready to go the next time with that same answer. Likewise, if there was one question that you weren't really able to answer very well, write down the question so that you are able to go strong the next time you get that interview question. Send a thank you email within 24 hours, 48 at the most. If you have been interviewed by multiple people, write a specific interview thank you for each one of those interviewers. Make sure that it's a little bit personalized, says something different. Of course, they have a job open, so they needed to interview you, but they didn't need to interview you, and they still took time out of their day. So express appreciation by sending that thank you email. Make sure that you're constantly reviewing, practicing, all the way up until you get that actual offer in hand. A lot can happen in the meantime, even if you feel like the interview went really, really well, even if you got great feedback at the interview, keep going, keep practicing and interviewing more. Now, as soon as you have accepted a position, you want to withdraw from all other searches. It's just the ethical thing to do. Always follow up. I mentioned earlier that you want to make sure you find out what the timeline is before you even leave that interview. So if they've told you maybe it'll be 2 weeks and it's been 3, go ahead and follow back up. Check back in. Don't say, hey, you never got back to me when you said you were going to, but just reaffirm your interest in the position and in that company, and let them know that, hey, I'm still really interested. Can you tell me what the timeline is? That way they know that you're being persistent and that you're still an active candidate. On the flip side of that, I would say if you do get a no, I would also encourage you to follow up anyway. In that case, maybe your response would be something like, well, since I'm still obviously going to be having to be interviewing further, can you tell me if there's anything I should do that would help me in the next round? You might not get feedback, but if you do get feedback, that's something that you can use to improve yourself for the next interview, and it's definitely worth hearing. Finally, maintain positive relationships. No matter what, if the interviewer was rude or if you realized, hey, this isn't an employer I'm interested in, that employer or that recruiter may end up at another employer, and in that case, if you make a bad impression, they're going to remember that. I actually had a story one time that happened to me where the interview was not positive, but I stayed positive even though I didn't get the job. And a couple of weeks later, I had a phone call from the team that said, hey, we really liked you. Unfortunately, our director didn't feel like you were the best fit, but our director's now gone. Would you be interested in considering that position? So you never know what can happen. So maintain positive relationships throughout the whole process. Be on your best behavior, so to speak. If you would like to conduct a mock interview, or if you have an additional question about the interview process, we'd love to meet with you. You can schedule an appointment through the Handshake at Illinois system, send us an email, or just stop by our office.